326 BC. The Hydaspes isn't a river, it's a weapon.
Across the water, Porus waits, behind a wall of war elephants. A frontal crossing means death. So Alexander chooses deception. He leaves the fires burning and slips into the storm unseen. Dawn betrays him. Horror strikes before the bridgehead can breathe. Then the giants hit. The ground shakes, and the line almost breaks.
He breaks the wings, not the center. The trap snaps shut. Hydaspes becomes legend.
With the Kofan Valley finally secured, Alexander did not pause to celebrate. He left Taxiles in charge at Taxila and pushed deeper into the subcontinent, aiming for the Hyphasis River. It sounded like a straight line on a map. In reality, it was a corridor of hostile borders, proud courts, and kings who did not plan to bow simply because a Macedonian army had arrived. To reach the Hyphasis, Alexander would have to cross the lands of many Indian rulers. Each one was a threat to his rear. And in a campaign like this, the rear was everything. A single uprising behind him could cut supply lines, isolate garrisons, and turn a victory march into a slow disaster. This stretch of the expedition, from Taxila to the Hyphasis, would become one of the hardest chapters of Alexander's career. It carried his empire to its greatest reach. It produced one of his toughest and most brilliant victories, and it drove his men closer to the edge than ever before. Before Alexander could even think about the larger powers beyond the river system, he had to deal with the world immediately in front of him. Much of North India was influenced by the Nanda Empire, ruled by Dhanananda. Greek accounts describe it as a giant, wealthy state with manpower that seemed endless, the kind of opponent that could swallow a tired invader through sheer weight alone. But Alexander could not confront such a threat with his back exposed. The kingdoms between Taxila and the Hyphasis had to be neutralized first, so emissaries went out. Tribute was demanded. Meetings were requested. Alexander's message was simple: come to the border, acknowledge his authority, and the storm might pass you by. One notable ruler, Abisares, submitted. He chose survival over pride. Another king, however, did not. Porus of the Pauravas answered differently. Greek sources reveal little about Porus's early life, but they paint a clear image of the man Alexander was about to face. A warrior king, brave and physically imposing. Said to be 7 feet tall, towering over his men like a living standard. But he was not just muscle. He was described as intelligent, cautious, and respected. When Alexander demanded tribute and a formal meeting, Porus replied that he would indeed meet him at the border, and he would bring an army. Alexander did not back away. He never did. In 326 BC, in the middle of the monsoon season, he marched toward the Hydaspes River. His host was not small. Think of a moving city of steel and discipline, Macedonian infantry, cavalry, archers, elite guards, and Taxilian allies marching beside them, men who knew the soil and the heat in a way the Europeans never could. Across the river waited the Pauravas. Their line was broad and confident. Infantry formed the core. Cavalry and chariots stood ready on the wings. But the true signal of danger was in front: elephants. Not one or two as curiosities, a whole line of them. Huge silhouettes in the rain haze, living fortresses with tusks. Their presence alone was meant to terrify horses, to break formations, to turn trained soldiers into scattered men. At their head was Porus himself, riding a large elephant like a throne that walked. Porus had chosen his battlefield well. The Hydaspes was wide, fast, and swollen from monsoon rain. A contested crossing here would be a nightmare. Alexander had forced a river at the Granicus, yes, but this was different. This was a barrier that punished impatience, and Porus had improved the position. By placing elephants in front of his battle line, he turned the river into a trap. If Alexander tried to cross under pressure, the beasts would loom at the water's edge, horses would panic, men would clump together, boats would overturn. A crossing could become a massacre before the real battle even began. Time, too, favored Porus. Abesares, though submitted, had promised to send reinforcements. Alexander needed a fast decision, but a frontal assault was not an option. The river and the elephants made sure of that, so Alexander did what he did best. He lied with his army. He made his camp in full view of Porus's men, as if he had settled in for a long wait. Campfires burned, guards stood watch. Foraging parties went out in daylight, and up and down the river, scouting groups rode loudly, deliberately, making sure the enemy saw them. Porus responded with equal caution. He kept most of his force drawn up opposite Alexander's camp. He also sent troops to mirror the scouts along the riverbank, matching movement with movement, watching for the moment the crossing began. This became a ritual. Days passed. The river roared. The rain fell. Alexander's men moved supplies. Scouts galloped along the shore. Porus's watchers followed like a shadow, and slowly, boredom and confidence did what swords could not. Porus began to believe Alexander would wait for the monsoon to end, that the Macedonian king was simply searching for future landing spots, that this was preparation, not execution. So the mirroring eased. The pressure loosened. The guards spread thinner. That was exactly what Alexander wanted. He had already chosen his true crossing point. It was far upstream, nearly 20 miles from the main camp, where the river bent and thick woodland pressed close to the water. The foliage concealed movement. It swallowed sound. And under that cover, Alexander's men had been building rafts and preparing boats piece by piece, hidden behind the routine of those noisy scouting rides. Now came the moment. Alexander ordered the campfires to stay burning. He left his usual guard outside his tent. He even dressed one of his companions as a double, a small deception meant to buy precious hours if Porus noticed anything strange. Then, during the night, he slipped away with a striking force. Not the full army, but a sharp blade of it. Phalangites, the silver shields, Hypaspists, Agrianians, archers, and a heavy portion of the cavalry. Back in camp, Craterus remained in command of the larger force, maintaining the illusion that the entire army was still encamped. Meleager and a body of mercenaries were placed between the camp and the crossing, ready to threaten movement and deepen the enemy's confusion. The plan was elegant. Craterus would hold Porus in place. Meleager would distract. Alexander would cross in secret and force Porus to turn. And once Porus committed his strength toward the surprise threat, Craterus would cross as well and crush him in a pincer. But war rarely respects elegance. As Alexander's column moved toward the crossing, a thunderstorm swept in. For a moment, it threatened to tear the mission apart. Wind and rain can ruin boats. Mud can swallow wheels. Noise can betray an army. Yet the storm also offered cover. Heavy rain blurred shapes. Clouds smothered moonlight. The river's roar drowned smaller sounds. Alexander ordered the crossing. Rafts and boats pushed into the dark water. Men gripped wood and rope. Horses trembled. Armor became heavier with each step, and slowly, the force reached what Alexander believed was the far bank. Then the cold realization hit. It was not the bank. It was an island, a large one, sitting in the river like a cruel trick of geography. Beyond it, another channel still separated Alexander from Porus's true side of the Hydaspes. There was no time to retreat. Not now, not with dawn creeping closer. So the men hauled the rafts again. They crossed the second channel as quickly as hands and fear could manage. But when they finally reached the real bank, the sky was beginning to pale, and Porus's scouts saw them. The crossing had succeeded, but the element of surprise was bleeding away. Alexander had expected to land unseen, to strike before Porus could form a response. Now he faced something far worse, a battle, head-on, with only a quarter of his army on the enemy's side of the river. Porus reacted fast. He sent a forward force to crush the intruders before they could assemble, cavalry and chariots under the command of his son, racing through wet ground toward Alexander's half-formed line. Alexander's men were still catching their breath. Some were still coming ashore. But Alexander did not freeze. He threw his horse archers forward. He split his cavalry into multiple squadrons, opening space, bending his line like a trap being set. And in the rain-dark dawn, the first clash began. In Part 2, Porus will bring up his elephants, Alexander will gamble on the wings, and the Hydaspes will witness one of the most brutal, chaotic fights of the ancient world. The Pauravan chariots came first, fast and proud, their wheels cutting lines into soaked earth. They were meant to smash into the confused landing force and keep it pinned until Porus arrived with the full weight of his army. On dry ground, chariots could be terrifying. They were a moving wall of speed and blades. But monsoon mud is a different enemy. It grabs at wheels. It turns momentum into chaos. Alexander's horse archers met them at a distance, not with a heroic charge, with a storm. Arrows hissed through wet air and struck men and horses that could not maneuver cleanly. The chariots began to slow. They tried to turn. The ground refused to cooperate. And then Alexander's cavalry moved in. He did not charge in a single wave. He broke his mounted force into smaller groups and sent them around the flanks, like wolves circling a wounded animal. It was a classic Alexander move: controlled violence, fast pressure from multiple angles, and in this terrain, the chariots were suddenly not hunters, but targets. The Pauravans fought hard, but the trap closed quickly. The forward force was shattered. Many fell where they stood. Others turned back toward the main army, broken and bleeding. Among the dead was Porus's son. That loss mattered, not only as grief, but as signal. It told Porus that Alexander's crossing force was not a scattered raiding party. It was the spearhead of the campaign itself, already biting deep. The delay had still achieved something, though. Those precious minutes bought Porus time. By the time the surviving cavalry fled back toward him, Porus had already begun to deploy. He did not panic. He did not rush blindly. Instead, he did what a king who trusted his own strength would do. He formed for battle. On the flanks, he placed cavalry and chariots where they could counter Alexander's riders. In the center, his infantry stood packed and ready. And in front, like a moving fence of muscle and terror, the elephants took their place. They were not simply animals. They were weapons with personalities. Each one could become either a battering ram or a disaster, depending on how the fight unfolded. Their riders and handlers understood this. Porus understood it too. He intended to drive those elephants into the Macedonian line and crack it open. Across from him, Alexander finally had the time to pull his men together. The river crossing had stolen breath and rhythm from his troops. The early clash had stolen more. But now the main contest was here, and Alexander's face hardened into that familiar calm. His original plan had depended on surprise. That plan was gone. So he built a new one, in the moment, under pressure, with the enemy already formed. Alexander's eyes went where the real danger was. The elephants, if they hit the phalanx cleanly, they could tear it apart. If they broke the Macedonian infantry, the cavalry would have nowhere to anchor. The whole army could unravel in the mud. So Alexander decided to fight the battle backward, not by striking the center first, but by destroying what protected the center. He would crush Porus's cavalry on the wings. He would strip away the shield. Then he would close in and suffocate the heart. To do this, he split his cavalry into two parts. With the larger portion, he would strike Porus's left. He would hit it hard and make it look like the main effort. He wanted Porus to react. He wanted Porus to pull cavalry from the other wing to reinforce the threatened side. And when that happened, the second cavalry group, under Coenus, would move like a knife behind Porus's right and strike from the rear. It was not a complicated plan. That was the point. It was fast. It was readable. It could survive the confusion of rain and shouting. Alexander also gave his infantry a strict order. Advance. But do not commit. Move forward like a wall, slow and steady, but hold back the full collision until Coenus's flanking move had succeeded. Alexander needed timing. He needed Porus's cavalry pinned and then broken before the center became a grinding contest with elephants. Then Alexander began. A wave of horse archers rode toward Porus's left and unleashed arrows in thick bursts. The Pauravan cavalry tried to respond, but the sudden pressure, the stinging rain of shafts, and the shifting lines made coordination difficult. In that moment of imbalance, Alexander charged with the companions. The impact was brutal, not a gentle push, a punch. Horses slammed into horses, spears snapped, men fell under hooves. And as Porus's left began to buckle, Porus did what Alexander expected. He shifted support from the right. He sent cavalry across to strengthen the threatened flank. The moment Porus committed, Coenus moved. His riders swung wide around the far side, staying just outside the main clash, then turned inward like a closing gate. When they hit, they did not strike the front of Porus's cavalry. They hit the back. The effect was immediate. A cavalry force can survive pressure from one direction. From two, it becomes a crowd. A crowd becomes panic. Panic becomes flight. Porus's cavalry began to break. It fell back, not in neat lines, but in scattered knots, retreating toward the only place that looked safe. The elephants, but the elephants were not a sanctuary. They were a wall. And now, as wounded cavalry pressed inward, Porus faced a dangerous moment. If he released the elephants too early, they might trample his own men. If he held them too long, his wings would collapse and the center would be surrounded. He chose to commit. The elephants moved forward. From Alexander's side, it must have looked like the earth itself was coming at them. Massive bodies pushing through rain, tusks angled, bellies and legs splashed through mud like ships through surf, and the air filled with the sound of horns, shouting, and the deep, unsettling rumble of huge animals in motion. Alexander responded with discipline. He pulled his cavalry back from the elephant's reach, refusing the trap. Horses can fight men. Horses do not want to fight elephants. Alexander understood that a cavalry battle here was not heroic. It was foolish. So he let the elephants go where Porus wanted them to go, into the infantry. Now the Macedonian phalanx closed in. Sarissas lowered. Lines tightened. Shields locked. The infantry advanced into a nightmare. The elephants hit. Men were thrown aside like broken toys. Some were crushed into the mud. Some were lifted by trunks and hurled into the air. Others were pinned on tusks. The phalanx, built to resist human shock, bent under an inhuman force. But Alexander had prepared them for this, not in comfort, in warning. Where the elephants charged directly, sections of the line gave ground. not to run, but to absorb the impact without shattering. Sarissas stabbed upward toward the mahouts, the handlers who guided the beasts. When a handler fell, an elephant could become confused, and confusion was contagious. Light infantry moved in around the elephants, faster and more flexible than the phalanx. Agrianians and other skirmishers attacked with javelins and blades, aiming for soft points. Eyes, trunks, legs. They did not need to kill the animal quickly. They needed to hurt it enough to make it fear. And fear is where elephants become dangerous to their own side. As the fight thickened, wounded elephants began to panic. They turned. They pushed back. They tried to escape the pain and noise, and their path of escape led straight through Porus's own infantry. Now Porus's center became a cage. In front, the phalanx pressed in. Behind, Alexander's cavalry struck again and again at the rear and sides, not letting the Indians breathe. In the middle, elephants rampaged through friend and foe, turning formation into chaos. This is where Alexander's style of war becomes clear. He did not simply defeat an army. He broke its ability to function. He turned its strength into confusion. He turned its elephants into a storm inside its own ranks. Porus fought on. Even as the situation worsened, he remained in the battle, surrounded by his guard, throwing javelins from atop his elephant. That image matters. A king refusing to leave, a leader visible to his men. It kept parts of the army fighting longer than they otherwise would have, but courage cannot rebuild a collapsing field. Gradually, Porus's men began to break. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic wave. It happened in pockets. A group fled through a gap, another followed, and then suddenly the gaps became roots, and the roots became a rout. Around this time, as Porus's line finally fractured, the remaining Macedonian forces began to cross in greater numbers. Craterus and Meleager brought fresh pressure and then pushed into pursuit, driving the fleeing groups away from the river and deeper into open ground. The Hydaspes battle was ending, but the story of Porus was not. Wounded, exhausted, and losing blood, Porus was eventually compelled by his men to retreat. Alexander, watching this king who had fought longer than most, did not order his death. He ordered his capture. Porus was brought before him. The two men faced each other not as equals, but as rivals who understood exactly what the other represented. Alexander asked how Porus wished to be treated. Porus's reply became legend. "Treat me as a king," and Alexander granted it. Porus was treated by Alexander's best physicians. He was not humiliated. He was not paraded as a trophy. Instead, he was allowed to rule as a vassal king under Alexander, and later even received more territory to govern. It was not charity, it was strategy. Alexander wanted stability. He wanted a powerful local ruler aligned with him to secure the region and keep the road behind him from collapsing. The victory was real, but it was not easy. The battlefield had taken a price. The struggle with elephants, the monsoon conditions, and the long hours of close combat drained the Macedonians in a way few battles had. Even among veterans who had marched across Asia for years, this fight felt different. It felt like the edge of the world, and there was another loss, personal and symbolic. Bucephalus, Alexander's horse, the mount that had carried him since boyhood through countless campaigns, died around this time, either in the battle or soon after, possibly from wounds. The exact detail is debated. The impact is not. Alexander took it hard. He founded a city, Bucephala, in his honor. It was a way to make grief permanent, a way to carve memory into stone and names. Yet even as the blood dried at the Hydaspes, rumors began to grow later in history, claiming something else entirely. That Alexander had lost, that Porus had actually defeated him, that the Macedonians had been broken and forced to bargain. It is a seductive myth, because the battle was brutal and the king survived. But the story does not hold up. The ancient traditions that push this claim lean on sources that drift into legend, turning war into fairy tale. Even those accounts still end with Alexander advancing, still pushing forward, still shaping the region after the battle. And that is the point. If Hydaspes had been a defeat, the campaign would have ended there. Instead, Alexander pressed on. But beyond the next marches, beyond the next cities and walls, something was already shifting inside his army. The men could feel the distance from home in their bones. They could feel the climate change, the diseases, the strange terrain, the endless rivers. They had survived Persia. They had survived deserts. Now they were fighting the world itself. And ahead, beyond the Hyphasis, lay reports of larger kingdoms, deeper armies, and elephants in numbers that made Hydaspes feel like a warning shot. The moment Alexander turned away from the Hyphasis, the war did not end. It only changed direction, and the road home would soon become even more dangerous than the road in. After the Hydaspes, Alexander did what victors always do. He moved fast. He turned shock into momentum. He accepted the surrender of nearby rulers. He took hostages where needed. He demanded loyalty in public, so no one could claim later that they had resisted. And he reshaped the region like a commander arranging pieces on a board. Abisares, who had submitted earlier, now came in properly. Others followed. Land was redistributed, and much of it flowed toward Porus. Not as a gift of friendship, but as a calculated anchor. Alexander needed a strong local ruler who knew the people, knew the river plains, and could hold the rear while the Macedonians marched deeper. Porus had fought like a king. Alexander chose to use him like one, but not everyone agreed to bow. Some peoples watched the Hydaspes battle and drew the opposite lesson. They saw that Alexander could bleed. They saw that elephants could terrify even veterans. They saw that the Macedonian army was far from home, soaked by monsoon rain, and forced to fight in a land that never seemed to end. For them, resistance did not look hopeless. It looked possible. Names began to repeat in the reports. The Cathians, the Oxydracians, the Malians, proud groups with strong towns and a hard reputation. They did not send submissive envoys. They prepared defenses. Alexander, after resting his army in Porus's lands, marched toward the Cathian capital of Sangala, with Porus beside him and a body of his men in support. The alliance was practical. Porus helped steady the region. Alexander, in return, confirmed his authority. It also sent a message. Resistance would not only face Macedonian steel, it would face Indian rivals as well. After a 3 days' march, Alexander reached the area near Sangala and found the Cathian army outside the city. They had chosen high ground. They had ringed themselves with makeshift defenses built from wagons, layered like crude walls. It was not elegant. It was not a polished fortress. But it was solid enough to slow an assault. And in war, slowing the enemy can be as valuable as defeating him. Alexander did not hesitate. He led the first wave himself. He dismounted. He fought on foot alongside his companions, close enough to see faces, close enough to smell sweat and wet leather. The first line of defenses fell without too much delay, but the second was harder. The Cathians fought like men defending the last step before their homes. The fight turned into shoving and stabbing in tight space, where discipline mattered less than stamina. Eventually, the Macedonians broke through again. The defenders fell back into the city, but Sangala presented a new problem. It was too large to fully encircle. A complete blockade would have stretched Alexander's forces thin, and thin lines invite sudden breakouts. So he chose the method that had served him from Tyre to Halicarnassus. He brought up siege towers. The assault dragged on. The defenders fought from walls, from rooftops, from any height they could claim. The attackers fought in the mud below, pushing machines forward while missiles rained down. Men died without seeing the enemy who killed them. Others died in bursts of close combat when the wall was reached and the line surged upward. When the city finally fell, Alexander made an example of it. Sangala was razed. Captives were taken in vast numbers, so many that in the telling, it feels less like a count and more like a flood of defeated lives. To local rulers watching from a distance, the message was brutal and clear. Delay him and you pay. Then Alexander marched again. For weeks, the army pushed inland through a landscape that punished them quietly. Not always with enemy blades, but with sickness, heat, strange water, insects, and dangers that did not carry flags. Tropical disease crept through camp. Snake bites and fevers stole men in the night. The further they went, the more the land felt like it was wearing them down on purpose. Still, Alexander aimed for the Hyphasis River. Beyond it, he had heard of richer and larger powers. Greek and local reports spoke of fertile lands, deep populations, and armies that seemed impossibly large. The name that loomed over these rumors was the Nanda Empire under Tana Nanda. The stories emphasized massive manpower and enormous resources. They also emphasized elephants in numbers that made the Hydaspes feel like a rehearsal. Alexander listened, and he still wanted to go. He believed, perhaps needed to believe, that the rumors were exaggerated. He believed that momentum and discipline could break any enemy, no matter how huge. He believed that the campaign's logic demanded one more push, one more river, one more victory, until the edge of Asia was not a dream but a fact. But for the first time, Alexander's greatest miscalculation was not about terrain or tactics. It was about his own men. At the Hyphasis River, the army refused to march any further. This was not a minor complaint, not murmuring, not a slow reluctance. It was mutiny in its purest form, a collective no, spoken without shouting, and therefore more terrifying. Alexander had heard fatigue before. He had heard fear before. After the death of Darius, there had been voices asking why the war had to continue. But this was different. This was the army drawing a line. Alexander tried to break it with words. He spoke of everything they had achieved, the nations they had conquered, the kings they had humbled, the wealth they had carried, the glory they had built together. He framed the next step as the final step, the last effort before immortality was complete. He tried to make the future sound like a reward rather than another wound. When he finished, there was silence. Not booing, not debate, just silence. Alexander invited anyone to speak. He told them, openly, to say what they felt. In earlier years, men would have answered. But now the memory of what happened to outspoken figures like Clytus and Callisthenes weighed on the camp like smoke. Even those who disagreed did not want to become the next example. Silence again. Alexander's frustration boiled over. He lashed out, declaring he would go on alone if he had to. He painted the army's refusal as betrayal. He threw down the harshest challenge he could imagine. Leave him, and he would still chase victory with whoever remained. The words hit hard. Some men wept, but the line held. Finally, Conus stepped forward. He was not a weak officer. He was one of Alexander's best commanders, a man whose courage was proven in battle, including at the Hydaspes. That gave him the right to speak without sounding like a coward. Conus began with loyalty. He reminded Alexander that the army had followed him through everything, through danger, through blood, through years that had turned boys into scarred veterans. But then he said what the camp could not say as a crowd. The men were worn out. Their weapons and armor were battered. Their bodies were no longer fresh. They had buried too many friends. They had endured too much distance. Those who remained had earned the right to return home and live with the glory they had already won. Conus warned that pushing farther with an exhausted army risked turning triumph into catastrophe. This was not fear-talking. It was experience. When Conus finished, the camp responded with approval. Not rowdy celebration, something heavier, like relief. Alexander dismissed them and stormed into his tent. He stayed there for 2 days. He waited for the mood to change. He hoped discipline, shame, or devotion would force them back into motion. It did not. On the 3rd day, he emerged and performed sacrifices as he normally did. Then he announced that the omens were unfavorable. The gods, he claimed, did not want the army to proceed. It was a face-saving exit, a way to agree without admitting defeat. But nobody cared about the excuse. They cared about the outcome. The army rejoiced. Tears returned. But now they were tears of release. Alexander reconciled with them, at least on the surface. And to mark the farthest reach of his campaign, he ordered the construction of 12 large altars, one for each Olympian god. A campaign that had begun in Greece 10 years earlier had reached its limit at the Hyphasis River in Punjab. Then Alexander turned back. Soon after, Conus died. Most accounts say illness. No ancient source directly accuses Alexander. Yet later suspicion would always linger, because Conus had been the voice of refusal, and powerful men often collect rumors the way they collect victories. The army returned toward the Hydaspes, where a large fleet had been built to carry them downriver for the long journey ahead. The river that had once been a barrier now became a road. But even now, with the direction reversed, Alexander was still Alexander. As long as he had an army, there would always be another conquest. And along the banks ahead, the Malians and Oxydracians still waited, unbroken, defiant, and ready to turn the retreat into a fight for survival.